Pause for a moment, because in this fictional spiritual story, the revelation arriving tonight is not about someone standing in the shadows with a weapon, nor about an enemy you should fear. It is about something far more subtle, the kind of opposition that can hide behind familiar smiles, ordinary conversations, and even moments you once believed were harmless. Imagine yourself sitting alone late at night, the room quiet except for the faint sound of rain against the window. Your phone is face down beside you, but your thoughts refuse to settle. You have been carrying a question you rarely say aloud: why does it feel like something keeps interrupting the life I am trying so hard to build? And just as that question rises again, a strange calm enters the room. In this fictional telling, the presence of Archangel Michael appears not as a terrifying figure, but as a symbol of courage, clarity, and protection. His voice is quiet when he says, "There is something you have misunderstood about the resistance around you." But what could you have misunderstood all this time? You remember the moments that never quite made sense. A door seemed ready to open, and suddenly it closed. Someone promised to support you, then became distant without explanation. You shared an idea with someone you trusted, only to watch the same idea return later as though it had never come from you. You tried to remain generous. You told yourself people were busy. You told yourself circumstances were complicated. You even blamed yourself, wondering whether you had become too sensitive. But tonight, the story asks you to look at those memories differently, not with suspicion, but with discernment. Because sometimes the deepest confusion does not come from knowing that someone disagrees with you. It comes from believing they are standing beside you while quietly hoping you never move forward. And if that was happening around you, how could you possibly recognize it without becoming consumed by doubt? Michael turns toward the window in the imagined scene, watching the rain trace silver lines down the glass. "Do not search for a villain," he says. "Search for the pattern." Those words change everything. Suddenly, you begin remembering not one dramatic betrayal, but a collection of small moments. The friend who always found a reason to question your confidence immediately after you felt proud. The relative who disguised discouragement as concern. The person who laughed when you spoke about a dream, then later asked why you had stopped believing in yourself. None of these moments alone seemed important. That was precisely why they were so difficult to recognize. The resistance had not arrived like thunder. It had arrived as tiny interruptions, repeated so quietly that you eventually mistook them for your own thoughts. But then another question surfaces: what if the voice telling you that you were not ready was never truly yours? For a moment, the atmosphere changes. The imagined room seems warmer, yet your chest feels heavier. Michael does not accuse anyone. Instead, he asks you to remember one particular conversation. You know the one. It happened on an ordinary day, perhaps over coffee, perhaps in a parked car, perhaps through a message you read more than once. You had spoken honestly about something you wanted to change in your life. You were excited, almost nervous, because saying the dream aloud made it feel real. The response you received was strangely cold. Not cruel. Not openly negative. Just enough doubt to make you hesitate. "Are you sure?" they asked. "Maybe you should wait." You agreed. You postponed the decision. You told yourself it was wisdom. But years later, why does that single conversation still echo in your memory? The fictional Michael lowers his voice. Because some people do not need to destroy your dream to influence you. They only need to make you question it. And suddenly the mystery becomes more complicated. What if the person working against you never considered themselves your enemy? What if they genuinely believed they were protecting you? What if their own disappointments had become the lens through which they viewed your possibilities? This does not excuse the damage, but it changes the shape of the story. You begin to understand that opposition is not always born from hatred. Sometimes it grows from insecurity. Sometimes envy wears the clothing of advice. Sometimes fear speaks through another person because they cannot imagine you becoming what they were afraid to become themselves. And if that is true, then the question is no longer simply, who was against me? It becomes, who benefited from me remaining small? The rain outside grows heavier in the imagined scene. You look down at your hands and realize something uncomfortable. You have spent more time trying to understand another person's motives than understanding your own wounds. You replayed conversations. You searched for hidden meanings. You wondered who talked about you when you left the room. You tried to identify the person responsible for every disappointment. Yet Michael's message is strangely different from what you expected. He does not tell you to confront anyone. He does not tell you to expose anyone. He tells you to reclaim the part of yourself that became silent because of what happened. The greatest victory, he says, is not proving that they were wrong. It is becoming free from the need to prove yourself at all. But then he pauses, as though there is something he has not yet told you. And that pause unsettles you more than any accusation could. You suddenly remember someone else. Not the loud critic. Not the obvious doubter. Someone quieter. Someone who was there during several important turning points in your life. Someone who always seemed supportive enough to remain close, yet somehow you felt exhausted after speaking with them. You never had a clear reason. There was no single betrayal you could point toward. They could even be kind. They could remember your birthday, ask how you were doing, offer help when you needed it. And yet, whenever you began moving towards something meaningful, their energy changed. Their questions became strangely specific. Their encouragement became conditional. Their compliments carried an invisible comparison. You had ignored that feeling because you did not want to judge someone unfairly. Michael looks at you again. This, he says, is where discernment begins. The imagined scene shifts. You are no longer sitting in your room. You see yourself standing at the edge of a long road just before sunrise. Behind you are the years you cannot change. Ahead of you is a path disappearing into pale golden light. You realize that the person who influenced you may not be the person you first suspected. The clues were never in the dramatic moments. They were in what repeatedly happened to your confidence after certain conversations. Then comes an unexpected twist. Michael reveals that the person who has been working against you in this fictional story may not have been secretly plotting anything at all. The deeper resistance may have been the belief their words planted inside you. A belief that whispered, "You are too late." A belief that said, "Someone like you cannot do this." A belief that convinced you to wait until you felt completely ready. And because the belief sounded like your own voice, you obeyed it. Your heart tightens. Could that be why some opportunities disappeared while you were still deciding whether you deserved them? Could that be why you kept asking for permission from people who were never responsible for your future? Could it be that the most damaging influence was not the person who doubted you, but the version of yourself that eventually began repeating their doubts? Michael steps closer in the imagined vision, and for the first time his expression becomes intensely serious. There is one person, he says, whose role in your story you have not understood. You wait. The silence stretches. You expect him to name the friend, the relative, the colleague, the person you have quietly suspected for months. But he does not. Instead, he tells you something that makes your entire understanding of the situation shift. The person closest to the center of this story, he says, is someone you trusted because you believed they knew you better than you knew yourself. Your breath catches. A memory rises immediately. A face. A conversation. A promise. And suddenly, one detail from that conversation returns with startling clarity: the sentence you dismissed at the time, the sentence that seemed ordinary, almost affectionate, but carried a meaning you were not ready to see. Michael does not reveal the name. Not yet. Because in this fictional story, the real revelation is not simply about discovering who stood against you. It is about understanding why you handed that person so much influence over your own direction. And just as you begin to remember exactly what they said to you that day, the imagined voice of Michael becomes almost a whisper. Before you decide whether they were against you, you must first discover what they knew about you that you had forgotten. The room falls completely silent. And now the memory is opening. The memory does not return all at once. It comes in fragments. First, the room where the conversation happened. Then the expression on that person's face. Then the exact moment their voice became softer, almost protective, when they said something you had never forgotten but had somehow stopped questioning. You don't really need to do that yet. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Almost loving. You were tired. You were uncertain. You were standing at the edge of a decision that required courage, and their advice gave you permission to remain where you were. So you listened. But now, within this fictional spiritual story, Michael asks you to examine what happened afterward. You did not simply delay one decision. You began delaying yourself. One postponed opportunity became another. One unanswered message became several. One dream you placed on a shelf slowly gathered dust while you convinced yourself that waiting was maturity. And the unsettling part was this: nobody forced you. You made every choice voluntarily. That is why the realization hurts. Michael watches you struggle with it, then says, "Do not confuse responsibility with blame." The distinction lands differently than you expected. You were responsible for the decisions you made, but that did not mean you were responsible for every influence that shaped those decisions. You were navigating with the information, confidence, and emotional strength you had at the time. You did what you thought would keep you safe. But safety and stagnation can sometimes look almost identical when you are afraid of losing someone. And suddenly another memory surfaces. There was a moment when you finally tried to move forward. You remember the excitement. You had almost decided. Then you told them. Their reaction was not anger. It was disappointment. A long silence. A small sigh. Then those familiar words. I just don't want to see you get hurt. You backed away. You never noticed how quickly your courage disappeared after hearing them. But Michael notices. In this imagined vision, he points toward a series of doors behind you. Each door represents a choice you once considered and abandoned. Some are opportunities. Some are relationships. Some are versions of yourself you never allowed to exist. You thought those doors closed because life rejected you, he says. But some doors closed because you kept waiting for someone else's approval. Your eyes fill with tears. Because there is a painful truth hidden inside that sentence. You were looking for betrayal outside yourself while carrying an old permission system inside yourself. You had learned to ask, will they be okay with this, before asking, is this right for me? And that question changed the entire meaning of your relationships. The person you suspected may never have intended to control you. Perhaps they simply discovered that you listened to them. Perhaps they noticed that their opinion mattered more to you than your own. Perhaps they leaned into that influence without ever admitting it even to themselves. That possibility is more complicated than calling someone an enemy. Because enemies are easy to understand. Ambiguous relationships are not. Michael's expression softens. You are not being asked to hate them. The words arrive before you can even form the thought. You are being asked to see clearly. And clarity begins showing you something you had not considered. The person may have been struggling with their own hidden fear. Maybe your growth reminded them of everything they had abandoned. Maybe your courage made them uncomfortable because it exposed their own hesitation. Maybe they genuinely cared about you while simultaneously feeling threatened by the possibility that your life would change. Human beings can carry contradictory emotions. Someone can love you and still be unable to celebrate every version of you. Someone can care about you and still prefer the version of you that needs them. That realization feels like standing in cold water. Because now the memories become impossible to categorize. Were they helping? Were they holding you back? Did they know what they were doing? Or were they simply afraid of losing their place in your life? You remember one conversation in particular. It happened after you had begun becoming more independent. You were speaking differently. Thinking differently. You were no longer asking for advice about every decision. And they noticed. You've changed, they said. You smiled and answered, I think I'm finally growing. They smiled too. But something in their eyes changed. You noticed it. You just didn't understand it. Not then. Now you do. The silence afterward had not been disappointment about your growth. It may have been grief over losing influence. And suddenly, the fictional message becomes more intimate. Michael tells you that some relationships survive only as long as you remain predictable. The moment you become difficult to predict, the relationship reveals its true structure. Who celebrates your independence? Who becomes distant? Who suddenly needs you to explain yourself? Who respects your boundaries? Who makes you feel guilty for having them? These questions are more revealing than accusations. You begin to understand why the title of this story cannot simply be reduced to one person's name. The hidden opposition was not necessarily a secret campaign against you. It was a pattern. A pattern in which your uncertainty became useful to someone else. And that is where the emotional stakes rise. Because you realize that you may have been preparing to confront the wrong person. You were ready to demand answers from someone who might not even understand the damage they caused. Meanwhile, the real work was waiting inside you. You had to decide whether their opinion still deserved the authority you gave it. Michael leads you farther along the imagined road. The sunrise is brighter now. Behind you, those old doors begin disappearing into the distance. But one door remains. It is smaller than the others. Painted in a color you recognize from your childhood. You stop. Michael does not explain it. He simply says, "This is where the story becomes personal." You reach toward the handle. Before opening it, memories rush forward. A younger version of you sitting quietly. Trying to be good. Trying not to disappoint anyone. Learning that approval felt safer than disagreement. Learning to hide ambitions that might make other people uncomfortable. Learning to smile when something hurt because explaining the pain seemed harder than carrying it. And suddenly you understand. The person who influenced you most did not create that wound. They discovered it. They found the place where you were already afraid of rejection, and their opinion became powerful because it touched something that existed long before they entered the picture. That realization changes everything. Because it means your freedom cannot depend on them apologizing. Even if they never admit what happened, you can still heal the part of yourself that made their approval necessary. Michael's voice becomes gentler. This is why I did not bring you a name. You look at him. For the first time, you understand. A name would have given you someone to blame. Clarity gives you something far more valuable. Choice. You can stop repeating the conversation. You can stop defending decisions you have already made. You can stop shrinking your dreams so someone else feels comfortable standing beside you. And perhaps most importantly, you can stop turning every setback into evidence that someone is secretly against you. Not everyone who disagrees with you is an enemy. Not everyone who leaves is a betrayer. Not every closed door is sabotage. But neither should you ignore patterns simply because recognizing them feels uncomfortable. Discernment lives between paranoia and denial. And you have spent too long at one extreme. Then Michael says something that makes you freeze. There is one final piece. The wind moves across the imagined road. The small door remains unopened. You have been asking who worked against you, he continues, but there is another question you have avoided. You whisper, "What question?" He looks directly at you. Who taught you to distrust your own perception? Silence. Your mind searches through years of memories. And then you find it. Not a friend. Not a colleague. Not even the person you had suspected. A much older memory. A sentence spoken by someone whose approval shaped your earliest understanding of yourself. You suddenly remember hearing it years ago. You remember how small you felt. You remember believing it. And you remember the promise you made afterward without realizing you had made one. Never make a decision that causes someone you love to be disappointed in you. The realization is devastating. Because the person you thought was secretly working against you may only have been continuing a pattern that began long before them. They did not create the chain. They simply held one of its links. And now you are standing at the point where the chain can finally break. Michael reaches toward the small door. But before he opens it, he turns back. There is something behind this door you have never allowed yourself to see. Your heartbeat quickens. What is it? His answer is almost impossibly quiet. The moment you first learned that your own voice could not be trusted. The door begins to open. And on the other side is a memory you have spent years avoiding, a memory connected to the person whose influence still reaches farther into your life than you ever realized. You take one step forward. Then another. And just before the memory becomes clear, you hear a voice from inside the room speak your name. Not Michael's voice. Not yours. Someone else's. Someone you recognize instantly. And the first words they say are the exact words that could change the way you understand everything that happened after that day. The voice comes from the other side of the doorway. I was only trying to protect you. You stop breathing for a moment. Because you know that voice. It belongs to the person whose opinion once carried enormous weight in your life. But the memory does not unfold the way you expected. There is no dramatic confrontation. No secret confession. No revelation that they deliberately planned your downfall. Instead, you see something far more human. You see two frightened people standing in the same room years ago, each carrying wounds the other could not see. You see yourself with a dream in your hands, trembling because you are finally brave enough to speak it aloud. And you see them listening with fear in their eyes. Not fear of you. Fear of what might happen if you changed. They had watched people leave before. They had experienced disappointment. They had learned that security meant holding tightly to whatever felt familiar. And when you told them you wanted something different, they interpreted your growth as a possible goodbye. So they said the sentence that changed everything. I was only trying to protect you. You look at Michael. The anger you expected to feel never arrives. Instead, something inside you becomes strangely quiet. Because now you understand that intention and impact are not always the same thing. Someone can believe they are protecting you while unintentionally teaching you to fear your own potential. Someone can love you while still being unable to release their grip. Someone can sincerely care about your happiness and still give advice shaped by their own unresolved pain. That does not erase what happened. But it releases you from needing to turn the person into a monster before you are allowed to move forward. Michael speaks softly. You do not need their guilt to validate your pain. Those words reach somewhere deep. For years, perhaps you imagined that healing would come when they finally understood. When they finally admitted they were wrong. When they finally said, should have believed in you. But what if your healing does not have to wait for that conversation? What if the apology you have been waiting for is not the doorway to your future? What if the doorway was always yours? You look again at the younger version of yourself. That child is still there. Still waiting. still wondering whether choosing a different path will cost them someone's love. You kneel beside them. For the first time, you do not tell them to be stronger. You do not tell them to stop caring. You simply say, you were allowed to want more. The younger you looks up. And something changes. The old memory begins losing its power. Not because the past disappears, but because you are no longer standing inside it. You are looking at it from the present. That distinction becomes everything. Michael turns toward the person from your memory. Their face is no longer threatening. They look tired. Human. Almost relieved. And you realize that perhaps they were carrying their own version of the same question. What if I lose you? Suddenly, the entire story becomes larger than betrayal. It becomes a story about attachment. About fear. About people sometimes trying to preserve relationships by preventing change, only to create the very distance they feared. You do not need to punish them. You do not need to chase them. You do not even need to convince them that you are right. You simply need to stop surrendering your future in exchange for temporary approval. Michael places a hand over his heart. Let them have their perspective, he says. And let yourself have yours. The words feel like a door opening inside your chest. You realize something else. The person who influenced you was never the final authority over your life. You gave them that position because you wanted to be loved without conflict. But real maturity is discovering that love does not require self-abandonment. You can care deeply and still say no. You can forgive and still create distance. You can understand someone's fear without allowing their fear to become your destiny. You can remember the good they gave you without pretending the difficult parts never happened. That is the freedom you were actually searching for. Not revenge. Not exposure. Freedom. The imagined sunrise grows brighter. The road ahead is no longer mysterious. It is simply unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity had been mistaken for danger for far too long. You take your first step. Then another. With every step, something falls away. The need to explain yourself. The need to convince doubters. The need to investigate every strange silence. The need to turn every disappointment into evidence that someone is secretly against you. You finally understand the deepest message hidden inside this fictional story. Sometimes the person working against you is not the person who speaks against your dream. Sometimes it is the fear inside you that repeats their words after they are gone. And sometimes the greatest act of protection is not discovering who wanted you to fail. It is discovering that they no longer have the power to decide whether you succeed. You stop walking. You turn around one last time. The person from your memory is still standing there. For a moment, you wonder whether you should say something. Then you realize there is nothing left to prove. So you simply say, I understand why you were afraid. But I cannot live inside that fear anymore. They lower their eyes. There is sadness in their expression. But there is also acceptance. Maybe they will understand. Maybe they will not. Maybe the relationship will change. Maybe it will eventually become healthier. Maybe it will remain distant. And for the first time, none of those possibilities controls your next step. Because your future is no longer dependent on their reaction. Michael smiles. Not triumphantly. Peacefully. You have been waiting for heaven to expose someone, he says, when what needed to be exposed was the belief that your life belonged to someone else's approval. You close your eyes. A tear moves down your cheek. But this tear feels different from the ones you cried before. It is not the tear of defeat. It is the tear that comes when a person finally realizes they can stop carrying something they were never meant to carry forever. The road ahead begins glowing beneath your feet. And suddenly you understand why August 18th became significant within this fictional story. Not because a mysterious date guarantees something supernatural will happen. Not because you are required to fear anyone. But because today can become the day you choose awareness over suspicion, courage over approval, and peace over endless investigation. You were looking for a hidden enemy. You found a hidden wound. And by finding the wound, you discovered the doorway out. That is the revelation. Not that someone secretly controls your destiny. No one does. Not the person who doubted you. Not the person who misunderstood you. Not the person who walked away. Not even the version of you who once made decisions from fear. Your life is still unfolding. And you are still allowed to choose what happens next. Michael's presence begins fading from the imagined scene. Before he disappears, he turns toward you one final time. Do not spend the next chapter watching behind you. You look forward. Spend it becoming someone your past could not have imagined. Then the light grows softer. The road remains. And you are standing alone beneath the morning sky. But you are not abandoned. You are finally standing with yourself. The silence no longer feels empty. It feels spacious. Like there is room for something new. Room for the dream you postponed. Room for the boundary you were afraid to set. Room for the conversation you have been avoiding. Room for the person you are becoming. And perhaps most importantly, room for peace. So if there is someone in your life who made you question yourself, do not rush to label them. Pause. Look at the pattern. Look at your own heart. Ask what belongs to them and what belongs to you. Keep the lesson. Release the weight. And if forgiveness is possible, let it free you not because what happened was acceptable, but because your future deserves more attention than your past. You do not need to carry anger into every new beginning. You do not need to become suspicious of everyone because one relationship hurt you. You do not need to harden your heart to prove that you have learned. You can become wiser without becoming colder. You can become discerning without becoming fearful. You can become stronger without becoming cruel. And you can walk away from what diminishes you without wishing destruction upon anyone. That is strength. That is maturity. That is freedom. So tonight, wherever you are listening to this fictional story, take one quiet breath. Think of the dream you almost abandoned. Think of the decision you kept postponing. Think of the voice that taught you to doubt yourself. Then gently tell yourself, I hear it. But I do not have to obey it anymore. Let those words settle. Because perhaps the most beautiful ending to this story is not discovering who was against you. Perhaps it is realizing that you have stopped being against yourself. May you find courage where fear once lived. May you find wisdom without losing your tenderness. May you recognize healthy love and recognize unhealthy influence without allowing either to define your worth. May the doors that belong in your future open at the right time, and may you have the clarity to walk through them without asking everyone else for permission. May your heart become lighter. May your mind become quieter. May your confidence return not as arrogance, but as the peaceful knowledge that you are capable of choosing your own direction. And may every painful lesson you survived become wisdom that helps you protect your peace without closing your heart. If this fictional message spoke to something you have been carrying, stay with that feeling for a moment. You do not have to solve your entire life tonight. You only have to take the next honest step. And if you want more cinematic spiritual stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with the one word that describes what you are choosing now: freedom, peace, courage, or growth. Let this be the moment you stop looking backward for an enemy and start looking forward toward your own becoming. The chapter behind you may explain how you got here. But it does not get to decide where you go next. And this time, you are walking forward with your own voice.